Okay, yeah, so I'm Cameron Dunnett, PhD researcher at Edge Hill University, a member of the Centre for Human Animal Studies there. And my PhD research, is interested in masculine performances in vegan among vegan activists, and also the kind of the masculinization of vegan activist spaces. Um, but in this presentation today, I want to focus on a little bit more on how I'm going to attempt to bring a kind of intersectional perspective to this research. I'll do this by just kind of outlining some of the kind of epistemological and methodological approaches that I'm going to adopt, specifically kind of using narrative interviews with participants across a range of genders to kind of draw on their experiences and use that to inform the research. So there's been some kind of arguably some moves as kind of various presentations this weekend have highlighted within vegan activist spaces to kind of highlight intersectionality. For example, IAVS work in the formation of the Black Veg Fest in the US, and Gerard also discusses, for example, vegan protest camps and vegan food giveaways in the UK. And to use Harper's words, sort of modeling forms of living outside of neoliberal capitalist solutions, so kind of moving beyond the kind of consumerist focus of certain aspects of the vegan movement. And there's some evidence of this kind of social justice kind of line of thinking being reflected in some of the recent developments within the UK vegan activist movement. For example, in their recent publication, Animal Think Tank talk about championing animal freedom, not just being about other animals, but it's also about shared commitment to advancing justice. So as, again, many presentations throughout this weekend have highlighted, this is obviously far from the full picture of vegan activism, and many work, for example, that of Rook and McNeil, have highlighted how aspects of the mainstream, or what some have referred to as white veganism, have prioritized violence of non-human animals over the marginalized other humans, and this can often have problematic impacts. For example, Adderwale again highlights how when he tried to introduce Black Veg Fest in the US, there was significant backlash among white vegan activists who felt that this was distracting away from the kind of core message of what vegan activism should be about. And in his book Brother Vegan, he reflects on this experience as kind of being like living in the wound whilst trying to heal. So, sort of this idea that experiences some of these animal first discourses can have negative impacts on activists of color or kind of gender minorities, for example. Another research, for example, that of Taylor, has highlighted how certain discourses within the vegan activist movement can reinforce kind of ableist understandings within the movement, for example, focusing on animal suffering and how this can pathologize bodies that fall outside of the norm. And there's also discrimination and gender and racial hierarchies that continue to be a problem within vegan activist spaces and organizations. For example, the work of Gorski highlighted how sexism remained one of the most significant reasons why animal rights activists left the movement, citing burnout. And for activists of color, things such as racist microaggressions, not feeling represented in leadership, and also just the exhaustion of having to explain racialized issues to white activists were all cited as reasons why they left the movement. And so in her recent survey, Camera highlights how many activist organizations, for example, nearly half of those who responded to her survey on harassment and discrimination said they felt that the organizations they're involved in had no policies in place to deal with harassment or discrimination. And as a result of that, even when individuals reported these instances, a third of those who were reported faced no consequences in the movement, with some actually kind of being positively promoted within animal rights organizations, kind of following instances of harassment or discrimination. So I want to kind of spend a bit of time in my presentation kind of discussing how my research is kind of attempting to kind of align itself with some of this thinking and perhaps contribute to this debate around kind of intersectional questions among vegan and animal rights activism, with a specific kind of focus on the UK movement. So my primary research is about how masculinities are performed by individuals within the UK activist movement. But what I want to focus on in a bit more detail today is my second question, which is about how and to what extent societal gender inequalities and other intersectional forms of oppression are challenged or reinforced within the UK vegan activist movement. So my epistemological approach to kind of thinking about how to tackle this and to highlight, I'm sort of currently developing my methodology and how I'm going to approach this. So of course, any feedback is greatly appreciated. But essentially, I want to draw on feminist standpoint theory, and specifically a kind of a pro-feminist standpoint, and combining this with the work of critical animal studies work, including those developing an animal standpoint, to try and develop a vegan standpoint. And where key to this is listening to and understanding the materialize of vegans and valuing the knowledge they have about their own experiences, specifically vegans of different genders, where both their gender identities and their vegan identities are kind of respected, and this knowledge is used to explore the kind of interconnections between the oppression of marginalized humans and non-human animals. So in order to do this, I want to try and conduct a kind of a biographical research project, which really focuses on kind of developing in-depth narratives, in-depth storytelling from vegan activists, where their subjective and specific experiences are drawn upon, and also the ability to kind of use kind of narrative interviews to explore how their subjectivities have changed over time. So how the interpersonal dynamics and sort of structural factors kind of interrelate within the vegan activist movement to kind of produce changing subjectivities. So specifically, I want to do this by combining life history interviews with vegan activists who identify as men or with masculinity, but also drawing on narrative interviews with vegan activists of other genders. And it's this second part of the research process that I want to focus on in a bit more detail today. So key to this is I want to conduct narrative interviews with women, with gender queer individuals, with gender non-conforming and non-binary individuals. And I want to use this as the initial stage of my research process. So through analyzing these interviews, so through analyzing these interviews and drawing on what I can learn from these initial interviews, to kind of inform the future direction of my research. And I think this hopefully aligns it with a pro-feminist standpoint, where the voices of women and gender minorities are kind of listened to and integrated into the research. And I think this is especially as important as a male researcher. I'm drawing on these experiences to kind of inform my research moving forward. So I want to do this through determining to what extent and in what ways vegan activists, organizations, as well as individuals challenge cis hetero patriarchal gender roles and performances, to draw on the term of Brooke and McNeil. So trying to kind of maybe move beyond some of the work that's kind of looked at gender roles and performances in activism spaces before, with a slightly more intersectional perspective. And asking participants to reflect on their personal experiences or observations of, for example, extremely exclusionary tactics, discrimination, harassment that they've perhaps experienced, and trying to sort of draw on individuals' different kind of identities, including class, ethnicity, race, age, and ability. And also, I think a key aspect of this research is exploring how their journeys towards veganism and activism are impacted by the kind of intersectional identities that they may have, and also how being involved in these spaces also then impacts their everyday lives, and how they their relationship with their communities outside of the vegan activist community, for example. So in terms of participants, I want to focus on vegan, animal rights, animal liberation, or animal freedom activists. And I think from an intersectional perspective, I think it's really key that I want to be able to draw on a range of sort of gender identities and sexualities, including cisgendered women, transgender women, genderqueer, non-binary, and androgynous individuals. So I think practically, I want to try and use some form of purposive sampling to try and reach out to a diverse range of activists of different identities, to try and allow me to add that extra intersectional perspective, as well as this gendered lens to my research. So how do I want to go about doing this? Essentially through these or how do I want to go about analysing this? I think I'll specifically focus on a dialogic and performance form of narrative analysis. So not just what the not just the content of what individuals are saying, but also the way in which they construct narratives within the interview space that is analysed in itself, where stories and narratives are presented, if not in their entirety, in large chunks, and sort of analysing, what these stories tell us about sort of subjectivities of activists. So I think ultimately, or at least I hope, that by combining and comparing the narratives of actors of different genders on experiences and the extent they differ, or maybe contrast within vegan active spaces, has potential to make a unique methodological contribution. And I think sort of key to this is drawing on the suggestion of a VIC, for example, of the need for future research to analyse and compare the ways in which men, for example, vegan men or activist men, talk the talk, so the way in which they perhaps use feminist language or describe themselves as more progressive, and analysing and comparing the relations between that and how they, for example, walk the walk. So how they describe themselves and how perhaps others describe them, is there a correlation or are there contrasts going on here, with a specific focus on gendered power relations and inequalities. So that's the direction that I want to take in my research. I would love to know if anyone had any sort of comments on how to sort of articulate that. Yeah, so just to quickly conclude, I've shown that vegan and animal activism has a complex relationship with intersectionality already, and often when an animal first philosophy or a masculinized approach to vegan activism, there's a negative impact on marginalized people within these spaces. And hopefully my research can further explore the dynamics of gender and intersectionality within the UK activist context through rich narrative data, and hopefully by interviewing vegan activists across the gender spectrum on gender issues and adopting an intersectional lens will perhaps yield interesting results that can further contribute to this intersectional activist research.
So I just want to extend my thanks to Corey, Zoe, the entire organisation team for bringing this event to life. It's really, really important. And I'm quite honoured to join you all and present my paper, The Gendered Politics of Veganism. Also, a quick shout out to my amazing supervisor who's here in the audience today. She got me through this project at undergraduate level. So yeah, much love to you, Helen, and thanks so much for being here. I must admit, though, I do have imposter syndrome. I'm actually coming from an arts background, but my dissertation was very sociological. I recently graduated from Duncan of Jordanstone College of Art and Design in Dundee. And while I'm currently pursuing an MRes at the moment, I do view art as an extension of my activism, particularly in advocating veganism and animal rights. And I've explored many themes like animal testing, horse racing, and childhood conditioning through my art, aiming to provoke discussion and positive change, hopefully. So much of my thinking actually came from Carol J. Adams and the conversation that I was lucky enough to have with her. The title of my dissertation was a play on her seminal text, The Sexual Politics of Meat, which discusses, as I'm sure you will be aware, overlapping oppressions between animals and women within society. But my theory is very much inspired by Kimberly Crenshaw's innovative concept of intersectionality, which is rooted in Black feminist thought, so I don't want to take anything away from that. She eloquently discussed the double discrimination faced by individuals like her, who are both Black and female within society. And in fact, it was Crenshaw herself who said intersectionality may provide the means for dealing with other marginalisations as well. And she reminds us that addressing inequality really requires recognising the complexity of our identities. And in the gendered politics of veganism, I was arguing that depending on your gender belonging and your vegan status, you may face a unique discrimination within a meat-eating patriarchal society. And it was also Carol Adams who said that animals and their animal parts are projected back to us as feminine. And this is certainly true when we look at advertisements. In this example here from the Laughing Cow, which is a popular dairy brand in the UK, it's not only oppressing the animal females by taking complete control over their reproductive systems, they're also romanticising it through their advertisements. So we see here a cow which is feeding a bull some cheese. Is it made from her own breast milk? Who knows? This idea that women would serve men brings a kind of gendered stereotype into things as well. And the whole portrayal contradicts the reality of these animals' interactions too. But interestingly, through my research, I've found that female voiceovers are preferred for adverts that need to persuade us of something. So for this Laughing Cow advert, it has a voiceover of a female woman, this kind of simultaneously oppresses and exploits both the non-human women and the human women. And it's quite ironic given that the product is from an industry which takes away women's voices. But the animal defence movement is by no means perfect. It objectifies its female activists and volunteers. Slogans like "Eat pussy, not animals," using vegan women's bodies, as a way to almost tempt omnivorous heterosexual male target audiences with the hopes of converting them to veganism. And Corey Wren has written about there being no evidence that this tactic is even effective in defeating anthropocentrism, but that there is a multitude of evidence linking sexually objectified women, sexist norms, and violence against women. So this is particularly problematic. And also, fathers and boyfriends express the most displeasure, it seems, towards female vegetarians and vegans. And this is significant given that they're more likely to maybe claim authority over women's bodies. Maybe women are more likely to go vegan because we want to take back some control of our bodies and our choices. Of course, the mainstream media is also very significant in targeting vegans, as supported by the well-known study by Colin Morgan on vegophobia. And it revealed that around 75% of UK newspapers portrayed veganism negatively. They even said in the paper, when the target is female, anti-vegan and sexist discourse may be combined. And I think this is what I was trying to name or give a new naming to in the gendered politics of veganism. But another study by McInnes and Hodson showed that both women and men do face biases for their vegan status, with women experiencing perhaps more harsh discrimination. As discussed elsewhere throughout the weekend, vegan men do benefit from the societal advantages due to their gender and a patriarchal society. And we have to talk about Piers Morgan, of course. In a televised debate with a vegan activist, he made a rather ignorant claim that vegans don't care about the little guys, referring to bees that are killed in food production. So his assumption that, you know, anything that's of significance must be male associated, which is completely false because worker bees are all female. I do acknowledge, however, that this research does have its limitations. Of course, gender is a spectrum, and I focused on binaries. So there's definitely room for further building on this theory. Additionally, I was undergraduate fine art student, so I wasn't yet trained in research methods, which I'm learning this year. So I really relied on existing knowledge, and I'm basically standing on the shoulders of giants here. So I recently secured a publishing contract through my university and plan to turn my dissertation into a book by the end of the year. So just watch this space. And I'm currently pursuing my Masters of Research, which is going to focus on vegan feminism, particularly regional veganism. I don't think there's much being spoken about on the Scottish level at the moment, so I'd really like to dig deeper into that. And I'd greatly appreciate any advice or resources from the community as I start my sociological research journey. So finally, I think that together as vegan sociologists, let's craft a future where the bonds of injustice are but distant echoes of the past. And I'd like to thank you all so much for listening to me today too. Thank you.
Go. So in my presentation, I wanted to sort of take a little trip back in history, and I'm one of the honorary sociologists. I'm a lawyer, so to look back at the court case where the whole concept of intersectionality actually was formed, I think is always a good little trip back, and then to see how it has expanded and how it can continue expanding more into providing the same type of protection and laws against discrimination for ethical vegans and for non-human animals. So again, the origin, as Lauren had mentioned, really the origin of intersectionality, let me make sure the volume's up, there we go, articulated by Kimberly Crenshaw, really explores the social, the economic, the political ways in which identity-based systems of oppression connect, overlap, and influence one another. And so as a law professor and authority in Black feminist legal theory, as well as critical race theory, Crenshaw coined this term, intersectionality, to deal with the fact that many of our social problems, so racism, sexism, are often overlapping, creating multiple levels of social injustice. And so she had a groundbreaking law review article, a very long title there, Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex. But that was the law review article that really broke through with the theory of intersectionality as we know it, and before it kind of expanded into other areas. But her the ideas of double discrimination, injustice squared, really come from this particular case that she chose. That this case just does a perfect job of highlighting these concepts. So this is a case from 1976, a federal district court case involving, it was a class action of Black female employees of General Motors, one of the major car manufacturers in this country, to illustrate. So this case really does an amazing job of illustrating double discrimination, because really the law totally failed to recognize the injustice that was faced by the Black female workers. So the plaintiffs in this case, there were 5 Black women who were among the first employees of General Motors to be laid off under this last hired, last fired layoff policy. So the plaintiffs sued General Motors for employment discrimination under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in this country, the major employment discrimination act that prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, sex, color, religion, national origin. So she alleged that, the class alleged that General Motors' last hired, last fired layoff policy discriminates against them as Black women, and therefore it perpetuates the past discrimination against them. So the plaintiffs were able to show that at trial that GM never hired a Black woman prior to Title VII being passed, which was 1964. And then by the time they did really start hiring Black women, just a few years later, they lost their jobs because of this. They ran into a major recession and they started laying off workers, and those who had just been hired, who were mostly the Black female workers, were laid off. So their argument was that this whole theory of last hired, last fired was really just prolonged and even worsened this past discrimination against them as a class. And the thing is, it was the Black women were a unique class because GM had hired Black men and they had hired white women. So it was only Black women who were facing this unique form of discrimination. So they presented all this evidence to the court, but the court refused to allow the plaintiffs to combine sex-based and race-based discrimination, even though obviously that's what was at play. So in the eyes of the court, the plaintiffs, as Black women, were attempting to create a new, and this is the words of the court, a new special subcategory of race and sex-based discrimination to be protected from discrimination. So the judge almost saw it as, oh no, you can't create this special category, even though in fairness, it should be that way. So the court found no precedent for recognizing Black women as a special class entitled to this protection. So the court found that the plaintiffs should not be allowed to combine the statutory, the Title VII remedies to create this new super remedy, as the court again referred to it, that would create, the court viewed it as, no, this would create some kind of relief beyond what the drafters of Title VII ever anticipated, which really is not, most of us can see that is not true. So the plaintiffs, as Kimberly Crenshaw said it so well, the plaintiffs fell through the cracks of the law. Undeniable discrimination against them as Black women that was allowed to endure, and it was yet deemed legally inconsequential simply because these plaintiffs could not be placed into one of two boxes, into the race discrimination box or into the sex discrimination box. And as you can see, that little overlapping category, they were just left to fall right through the cracks. So the court's framing of the issue in de Graffenried as one that must be either race-based or sex-based discrimination really represents this idea of a pervasive framework that frequently renders Black women legally invisible and without legal recourse. And so this injustice that was witnessed is representative of what we refer to as the single axis framework employed by our society that contributes to the marginalization of Black women in both in feminist theory and in anti-racist politics. So Crenshaw brought this theory to life by using this case's background and then bringing in her analogy of a traffic intersection to illustrate the way that the roads in our society are structured by race and gender. So her analogy of the roads of intersection represent identities like race and gender. The cars on the road are policies that affect those identities. So someone standing at the intersection would be hit by traffic from both roads. So just as in this case, Black women hit at the intersection of the roads representing Blackness and femaleness would not be able to get any help. So neither a race nor a gender ambulance could come along and help her, because they would ask, which road are you on? And because she was on neither of the roads, she would not get help, because only one identity in the view of society, only one identity had jurisdiction over her. So which leads to the whole idea of intersectionality, the belief that oppressions are interlinked and cannot be solved alone. And so the famous quote from Audre Lorde, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. So Crenshaw's, when we go to expand this, and as we know, Crenshaw's theory has been expanded into so many areas, and there's already been so much movement to it, expanding it to non-human animals and ethical vegans, who, of course, are in the corner with non-human animals. But it is this powerful vehicle for showing the circles of oppression that are experienced by socially marginalized people who endure the double discrimination and injustice squared as they confront all these burdens: racism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, and more. So if we can acknowledge that non-human animals and ethical vegans also bear the burden of systemic oppression, really that's an essential step on the pathway to justice and equity for humans and non-human animals. So the oppression of non-human animals in the form of speciesism, the belief of human supremacy over other animals. And I love this quote because it says it's the basic form of oppression in our society. It underpins all other forms of oppression by teaching us to be oppressors from childhood. And I think that says it so well that even as, unknowingly as kids, if we start to eat meat without knowing how that's built into oppression, but it's almost that very first form of oppression that then we encounter other forms as we go along. So ethical vegans standing in solidarity with non-human animals bear that burden as well of identity-based systems of oppression as they go up against the norms really of the carnist society. And just a few words on, of course, speciesism, that idea that, that we recognize that non-human animals, feel the same pain, the same joy that we do. And really from an ethical point of view, we all stand on the same, on equal footing, whether we stand on 2 feet or 4 feet or none at all. And then discrimination against vegans, of course. Vegans are often treated worse than others simply for being vegan. And that's either because the vegophobia or structural reasons, as we saw, as we see in cases involving ethical vegans, like Jordi Casamachada being, fired because of speaking out against, policies contributing to the carnist society and really discriminate against him because of his vegan beliefs. So vegophobia entails this derogatory portrayal of vegans, of course, as, self-righteous, judgy, goody two-shoes. And it is this form of, do-gooder derogation, putting down of morally motivated others. And it's, just from the language that we hear, at the expense of vegans, strong, muscular people are referred to as beefy, but lazy people are couch potatoes, and unresponsive people, vegetables. So it's all in the language, in the views of society, and of course it can also be intentional bullying, harassing because one is vegan. And of course the Simpsons being pretty popular in the U.S. as well as in the U.K. You know, we all see Jesse Grass of The Simpsons and kind of the role model to Lisa the tree hugger, but being, you know, poking fun at the vegan, that the level 5 vegan who doesn't eat anything that casts a shadow. So it's kind of made into almost a joke of sorts that, oh, you know, the silly vegans, just as a way to, because it's fear and backlash, of course. And it's also because veganism is rooted in social justice, and it's looked at as a rebuke to the, you know, majority's values. And of course, the concept of cognitive dissonance goes along with this, that, you know, the meat paradox, that as vegans, many of us know, you know, you sit at a table and if someone else is having meat, they start speaking up because they feel it's kind of guilty that they're eating meat. And even we don't say a word, it forces the omnivore to acknowledge that consuming, you know, in their minds, they're thinking about it. And vegans are always expected to explain themselves to omnivores, but omnivores never have to explain themselves to the animals. And so, and also one point I want to make too, of course, of the second order discrimination, how as vegans often, you know, ethical vegans are doing that because of their love for animals, because of their advocacy for animals. And so oftentimes, even when vegans are discriminated against or harassed or poked fun at, vegans often don't speak up for themselves because they view that as, oh, that's just inconsequential compared to the discrimination and, you know, terrible treatment against non-human animals. And so just as a final word, how this quote from John Stuart Mill, that every great movement must experience 3 stages: ridicule, discussion, and adoption. And if we look back at so many of the movements, the LGBTQ plus rights movement, environmental justice, critical race theory, you know, they've had their time of being in sometimes, and still unfortunately are still scoffed at by mainstream societies. Oh, that's too radical. As well as animal rights, vegan rights movement have had their share of the backlash. But by ensuring, you know, that we maintain that intersectionality and bring non-human animals to the forefront of the concept, hopefully that will empower all these movements to new heights. So thank you very much.